There's a part in our anthem today for audience participation. You know the words. I will turn to you when it is your time to sing with us. So I hope that you will join in and sing fervently.
I'm not sure we need a sermon after that. Wow. If you have ever thought that your extended family is the only one that has issues, if you are ever tempted to believe that all the folks in the Bible were paragons of virtue and piety, then I invite you to take some solace in the stories to be found in the book of Genesis, from Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, to Noah and his sons, to Lot and his daughters, to the long lineage of Abraham and Sarah and their sometimes messed up descendants. All of these characters are more than fully human, full of flaws and foibles, failings and fecklessness. Today's story is of Isaac and Rebekah and their children. And you may recall that Isaac was the son of Abraham and Sarah, the ones who had followed God's call to move to a new land and had received God's promise that they would have a son, even in their old age. Isaac is that son, and to make a long story short, he grows up and marries Rebekah, and that is where we pick up today's story. For where Rebekah is pregnant now. But that pregnancy about drove her crazy. Did you hear it? Quote, "The children contended with one another within her, and she said, 'If it is going to be this way, why would I want to live?'" In fact, these two who are already struggling in the womb will turn out always to be contending with one another, fighting one another for everything. And even though they are twins, they don't look or act anything alike. Esau, red-haired. Jacob, very little hair. Esau, the hunter. And Jacob, the kid who stayed at home in the family tent reading and brooding and thinking. These two had even contended at the very moment of their birth. Esau arrived first, but just barely. For but a few seconds later, Jacob is born, holding on to Esau's heel. Have you heard the saying, he sold his birthright for a mess of pottage? Today's story is where that saying comes from. It means to give up something that's very, very, very important for something that's not important at all, to trade away the essential in favor of the trivial, where what is given up is now gone forever, and what is gained is fleeting and insubstantial, a mess of pottage. That was the case for Esau. His life was forever changed by trading away his 2/3 share of his father's estate as the firstborn, and in that pottage moment to thereby become instead simply one of the many heirs of Isaac, lumped in with all the others for a small share of that estate. And so instead of having the resources to carry on the family business, to become a successful rancher and farmer like his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham, he ends up having to seek his fortune elsewhere because the family ranch, the family farm, couldn't support him. And while we may think unfair the Hebrew custom of the day that 2/3 of the inheritance went to the firstborn, it was nonetheless the way things were, and Esau knew it. And yet he traded away that inheritance for a full belly of beans that would last but a few hours, a mess of pottage. But let's not be too hasty to judge Esau here, because he is us sometimes, isn't he? Sometimes Haven't you or I traded away something of great worth for a fleeting satisfaction or pleasure? And sometimes that pleasure turned out to not even be that pleasurable. I mean, have you ever said something to another person, and even as the words are coming out of your mouth, you knew that while they might feel good for a moment, they would in fact never be able to be taken back, and they would bruise someone, hurt a relationship forever? A mess of pottage. Or have you ever just had to have the last word? You just had to. And that was the word that escalated things in a way which would make healing and reconciliation a long time coming. Have you ever stood by silently while a mean or racist or homophobic or religious joke was told in your presence, and instead of calling the person on it or even just not joining in the laughter, you said nothing, not even later privately, or you went ahead and laughed yourself because it was easier than not laughing? A mess of pottage. I know that I have done all those things and thereby traded something truly important for something cheap. I have sometimes let my words come too quickly when I should have kept my mouth shut, or sometimes I have kept my mouth shut when I should have spoken up instead of standing mute. A mess of pottage. The story of Isaac and Rebekah, of their parents and their descendants, are the stories of what will become the people of Israel. These stories will become part of the Hebrew people's identity as they develop over the coming centuries into a nation with a king and laws and all the things that nations have, and as nations sometimes will. In the centuries to come, the Hebrew nation will sometimes lose its way and will need to be called back by the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah and Micah and so on. But there is a sense in which every single prophetic word that comes later to the Hebrew people is always rooted in the very simple lesson taught by Esau's awful trade, and that is this: don't ever give up what is truly important for a mess of pottage. Don't ever give up the emphasis on justice to the widow and the orphan. Don't trade that away. Don't ever give up on the godly virtue of hospitality for everyone, for the allures of being suspicious of outsiders. For while xenophobia is mighty seductive, it trades the best of what God calls us to be for a mess of pottage. And on this weekend, when we have celebrated our nation's birth, I look back on our history as a people, as a nation, and remember that the truly marvelous thing about the United States of America, the truly unique thing, the thing that ought to be at the root of all pride and patriotism, is that we are a country founded not on ethnicity or language or kinship or class or wealth, but on a set of ideas that all human beings are created equal and are to be given equal rights under the law, equal opportunity, and that all are to be free. That is the furthest thing from a mess of pottage that there could be. Now, I'm also aware that we as a nation haven't always lived up to that ideal. Yet I can still read President Lincoln's words from his second inaugural and get goosebumps. With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us strive to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, and to cherish a just and lasting peace, with malice toward none. What an amazing thing to say in March of 1865. But I am sadly aware, too, that after Lincoln's assassination, that healing, reconciling, godly vision was traded away for the nasty pottage of Jim Crow laws and the denial of voting rights to black folks and the denial of the right to own property to those of Chinese and Japanese descent, and a climate of hatred that made lynchings a public after-church sport in too many places, and a set of vicious immigration laws in the 1920s that went hand in hand with horrific persecutions of that era, and the sacrifice of too many children on a pernicious doctrine that separate schools could ever possibly be equal. A mess, a pottage. And this morning, my friends, I fear that the temptation to choose the pottage too often pervades our national life today. The mess of pottage, for example, that is too often the media's insistence that everything about national life can be reduced to a simplistic fight that disrespects your intelligence and mine. Too often, the media merrily suck down the swill of the pottage of character assassination from the left or the right, preferring to fixate on the ephemeral and the fleeting and the trivial, instead of focusing respectfully, even when there is profound disagreement, on what Dr. King called the content of a man's character. The pottage that is set before us every day is the swill of assuming the worst about those with whom we disagree politically, of demonizing them. It is the polluted potion of ridicule instead of civility. And each and every day, too much of our culture and our media ask you and me to lap it up. And they do that because we tune in and we buy newspapers and we click on the websites where that happens. One of the most terrifying lessons to be learned from Esau's story is that some decisions bring consequences that cannot ever be undone. But on this Independence Day weekend, the good news for our country is that not only is America founded on a powerful and wonderful and moral set of ideas, those ideas are also self-correcting. They carry within themselves the possibility of becoming ever more true when they have not been as true as they should have been. I think of the hatred toward the Germans in World War II, and then I think of the way our nation turned away from the pottage of revenge and instead instituted the Marshall Plan that quite literally saved hundreds of thousands of human beings with malice toward none. I think of the way that 2 years later, when Berlin was blockaded and besieged, the United States military organized the most massive movement of food the world had ever seen in an airlift that again literally kept thousands from starving with malice toward none. I think of the way that both Presidents Reagan and Clinton recognized that the ideas of freedom and equality had been misused and misplaced amidst the pottage when they both apologized to the Japanese Americans for the internments of World War II and to the Hawaiian people for the utterly unlawful seizure of their country, for not living up to those ideals that make us who we are at our best. "15 years ago, Barbara and I and our youngest daughter found ourselves in Ely, Nevada. You ever been to Ely or Ely, Nevada? Then you know it's a hardscrabble place, set amidst an awesomely desolate landscape, hours from any big city. That night, we found ourselves at the county fairgrounds, sitting on the hood of our car, parked there with hundreds of others to watch the July 4th fireworks light up the desert sky. On one side of us was parked a young Hispanic American mother and her 3 small children, and as the fireworks burst over our heads, those children with excitement and glee waved their tiny American flags and shouted, "Mira, mira, look, look." Parked on the other side of us was a family of Laotian Americans, Hmong refugees, I'm guessing, who were sharing a meal of hot dogs and French fries, and who were also captivated with the incandescent tribute to freedom above our heads. Not too far away, we discovered was a family of Japanese American folks whose grandparents, we learned, had been interned by their country not very far from where we were that night. And they too shouted with excitement at each enormous explosion. And parked behind us was a Muslim American family outfitted in beautiful robes whose children had little American flag stickers on their chests. And a couple of cars over was a gay couple, sometimes shyly holding hands and expressing their delight along with the rest of us in shouts and clapping as the awesome desert sky was bewitched with beauty. And we, Scots-Irish and German descendants, got lumps in our throats. And I remembered why I care for this country so much, why I want so much for it to continue to strive to live up to the ideals that gave it life, because when we are at our best, we do indeed say no thank you to the pottage of hatred that gets placed before us, and we do instead seek to make even more real, even more true, our commitment to welcome everyone with malice toward none and charity for all, seeking to live out those words inscribed on the Statue of Liberty about welcoming all those who yearn to be free. The tragedy of Esau is that his choice was irrevocable and the consequences unchangeable. But friends, the good news this morning for you and me as individuals and for our nation is that the grace of God offers us transformation in every moment. The grace of God offers us the courage not to eat from the bowl of pottage, but instead to reach for the right thing, the best thing, the thing that will truly nourish now and into the future. The grace of God will allow us to correct what needs correcting and make possible what had seemed might never be. And isn't that better than a mess of pottage?